So thank you all for joining us this afternoon for the second of our AIMS research conversations this term, week 4. I'm Juhan Vavaina, the Bahari Associate Professor of Sasanian Studies and the faculty's research director for Michaelmas term. So our first pair this afternoon will be Professor James Mallinson in conversation with Dr. Bogdan Diaconescu, and Professor Mallinson is our newly appointed Bowdoin Professor of Sanskrit. He's an authority on Indian religious and cultural history, in particular asceticism and yoga, and they're practitioners in India. The study of Tantra as well, pilgrimage, textual criticism, and the editing of Sanskrit texts. His eclectic interests also span Old Hindi, Zoroastrianism, art historical and ethnographical study of Indian asceticism as well. His current projects include Light on Hatha, a critical edition of the Haṭhapradīpikā, the most important text on physical yoga, and it's a joint UK-German project funded by the AHRC and the DFK. And the wish-fulfilling jewel of yoga, a critical edition of the Yoga Chintamani of Shivananda Saraswati, which is funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities. His respondent, Dr. Bogdan Diaconescu, is our departmental lecturer in Sanskrit. His research interests include the textual, discursive, and historical study of Indian thought, and he takes a contextualist and interdisciplinary outlook and integrates insights gained from extensive study of Indian philosophies with outstanding Sanskrit traditional scholars in Benares and Pune. So, he has also taught classes in Sanskrit and Indian philosophical and religious traditions and conducted research in various academic functions at the universities of Lausanne and Freiburg, Switzerland. So, with that, let's go, and then I will introduce our second pair in the second half.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Johan, and asking me to do this, and thanks everyone for coming along. Good afternoon all. It's more than I normally get to talk to in my Sanskrit sessions. And I hope no one's come along for sort of yogic insights or new yoga exercise practices or anything like that. No demonstrations. I just have even if you wanted, I would be refusing. And so what I'm going to talk about is really the process of editing this text. I'm afraid there's some quite technical material in there, which I will move through quite fast because I don't understand half of it, which is one of the great things about working in a team. This is a joint UK-German project. And I'll dive right in. Why are we editing this text? What is this text? The Haṭhapradīpikā of Swatma Rama. It's a manual of physical yoga practice composed in about 1400 in South India, probably there at Sri Shailam in Andhra Pradesh. Why is it so important? Okay, first of all, it's the first text to focus exclusively on Hatha physical yoga, and also the first text to have. Previous text did mention Hatha Yoga, but it's the first to put it in the title, and the first to focus exclusively on it. It's the first text that teaches any complex physical postures and complex breath control techniques as part of this system of Hatha Yoga. And the first text to teach these various cleansing practices, which people who have studied yoga might know about. These rather bizarre sort of ways of cleaning your insides and so forth, which I won't be going into. First to teach any of them. And it's the first Hatha Yoga text attributed to a human author. So I will say a bit about it's a compilation essentially with authorial verses interspersed. And all the previous texts that it draws on are attributed to divine saints or gods and so forth. And looking more to the actual transmission and the constitution of the text, we know there are at least 250 manuscripts of it all over the subcontinent and further afield. So that's really what I'm going to be looking at, is how does one deal with that many manuscripts. It's been extremely popular, still is to this day. There's been over 100 translations into various different languages. There have been editions, but I think the most manuscripts used for any edition was 7 or 8, and they were all from a pretty defined area. So that's kind of, a very kind of tunnel vision view of the text, which is one of the reasons we thought it was necessary to produce a new edition. It's cited extensively in subsequent compendia and commentaries. Okay, so as I think the next thing, it sets the blueprint for Hatha Yoga. Effectively, after that, the structure of the practice as outlined in this text is what everyone then refers to in any subsequent text. So that's why it's so important. Now, editorial problems. Well, the first one I've mentioned already, large number of manuscripts, over 250. multiple recensions. So within those 250 manuscripts, actually I can't remember how many, we've identified at least a dozen different recensions. Most are 4 chapters and about 400 verses, but some are 3, some are 5. I think we get a 6 chapter, a 10 chapter, and so forth. So we have to deal with that as well. And there's at least 20 source texts, as I said. So the Swatmarama, must have been sitting surrounded by manuscripts, and he's just drawing on all these different texts in order to put his compilation together. And that results in extreme contamination, I would say. And when I say external and internal here, what I mean is that, so within the transmission of the text itself, we can tell that scribes often have more than one manuscript, and we're looking at and taking readings from both. But then we also have the problem that the source texts were being transmitted separately, and they too were changing, and then their readings were coming back into it. So the whole thing, the contamination is as bad as anything I've ever worked on, which makes, almost all Sanskrit texts that I've worked on anyway have a contaminated transmission. So it's always pretty much always impossible to do a purely mechanical reconstruction of the text just by constructing a stemma, but we tried, as I'll show you. So editorial strategy, and this is where it gets a bit technical, but I won't dwell too long on some of these technical points. So what we decided to do first of all is, as a team of 5 of us, 3 based in Germany, 2, so my side of it, there's 2 of us, or he's now in Tasmania, which makes for quite annoying Zoom call timings, but anyway, other than that, it's great. So what we thought we would do, and we've got research assistants in India based in Pondicherry who have been helping with the collation. So we decided first of all to collate the first 20 verses of all the manuscripts, and also to identify the different structures, so as I say, number of chapters and number of verses in each chapter. Then this is where it gets technical, analyse the relationship of the witnesses using various bits of technical software, which I won't go into much detail, but I'll show you some pictures which outline that. Then produce an unrooted tree, i.e. this program produces a diagram that shows the relationships between all the manuscripts, but doesn't identify a source. So you then, using philological analysis of the text, you have to identify what you think might be the earliest bit and then sort of pick the tree up. I'll show you in a minute with a diagram. Root the tree, as I said, and then compare the resulting stemma to the recension analysis. I'm going to show you pictures that explain all of this. Then identify, then what we decided to do, it became apparent that there were some core manuscript groups, that all the manuscripts fit into 9 or 10 groups, and we decided to collate just a few examples from each one. Okay, so that was our overall strategy. And then, of course, through repeated reading and application of that stemmatic analysis, we refined it and refined it and refined it until we get to a satisfactory edition, so the project's been going for 2.5 years, and we are planning it finishes in February. Okay, so produce an edition based on the earliest recension. And then I'll show you, hopefully, I don't know how much am I doing for time, already going a bit over time, but hopefully I can show you the online edition if the technical, I've tried to insert it into the slideshow, so we'll see. Okay, so there's lots of huge files of data. This is a spreadsheet. This is just showing you the first sort of 10 or 15 manuscripts, with all the information we can about the manuscripts on there. I think we've actually, I said there was more than 250. We've looked at 180. So we've done this for 180 different manuscripts and various bits of data, sort of particularly the structure. That's been, as I've mentioned a few times, that's been very useful. So how many chapters, how many verses in each chapter, that's quite a good way of working out, of grouping the manuscripts. Then we have to do all this sort of stuff and put it into these huge files, which then gets, this is Niels, one of the German postdoc, does most of this stuff, so please don't ask me any serious questions about how the Nexus files and all that works, but I'll show you what comes out of it. Yeah, so you have to draw up a parallel collation of all the different witnesses and then run it through this Nexus thing, and then you get a tree, well, that's not really a tree, is it? That's just an unrooted tree, whatever that might mean. It's not a good metaphor, is it? There's not such a thing. But that shows you the relationship of all the manuscripts. And then, as I said before, as you read the text and you work out, you get a reasonable idea of what you think the transmission might be, and then you pick that up from a certain point, which will produce something like that. Okay, so that then gives you a stemma. And then we sort of repeat that process. As it's a lot of back and forth between this technical analysis and then reading the text. And well, I'll talk a bit more about that at the end. But then there's analysis by structure. Okay, so this shows you how many is it? 8 different major recensions. It's 1, 2, 3, 4 at the top. That corresponds to the different chapters. And then you can see how different parts move around. That one is that a light blue? I'm colourblind. Where it's a Vajroli. That one's sort of interesting example because it's of this sort of slightly extreme sexual practice of sorts, and it gets moved around. You know, some people get rid of it; they don't like it. Some people put it in a chapter at the end saying it's not suitable for, you know, don't read beyond this, has a sort of content warning, that kind of thing. So anyway, and then other bits, similar things are moved around like that. So by using that structural analysis and the stemma, we then, we've drawn up, that's our kind of more basic stemma of various different manuscript groups. Okay, and we finally identified, I think it was only about 6 months ago, we realised that group, there is denoted by 1, it's now alpha, we keep changing the sigla, it's a nightmare to be honest with. We think that's the sort of earliest form of the text that we can identify. We do have one other technique. So we've been editing using these manuscripts here, but it's a bit of a cop-out. If we're reading a verse and we can't find a reading we like, it's called a marmasthana, which means a sort of sensitive point in Sanskrit, and then we look at every single manuscript, and we can normally find a reading that we like if we look at 180. But that's obviously a slight cop-out. So that's a marmasthana example for. There's a list of names of great yogis, and you can see there's 40 different variants just for one name. Okay, so then we produce a working edition, and these we've been reading at various workshops and online on Zooms and so forth. And we go back and forth, reading the edition, and then reworking the stemma, reworking the analysis, reading it again, looking at, and then one of the researchers in Marburg, Monsieur Demote, she will come back to us and say, hang on, this doesn't work with the stemma, what's going on, highlight it, we read it again, we check. And so, yeah, some of these things, some of these passages we've read probably 10, 20, 15 times just to keep going over and over again. So the plan is to go live on 24th of February 2024 with this. Is this going to work? Yes, amazing. So that's the sort of online edition, and it's quite, one of these, you can vary the display, there's all sorts of options. I could spend half an hour playing around with this, but you can change how the text is presented. That's a sort of the basic readings, the ones we think are important. You can then look at more readings, testimony and subsequent texts, and then we have what we call a philological commentary explaining our choices. Then there is a very influential 19th century commentary, and we have that with analysis and so forth. So that's where we are with that now. Will this work if I press next slide? Yes, I'm amazed. Concluding thought. Am I all right for time?
Yeah.
Great. So concluding thoughts on the editing process is the use of the complicated phylogenetic software. Yeah, I should have said it's based on, those of you who don't know, it's called cladistics, and it's developed in biology, the software. I think now, actually, there's a big volume just came out in Germany last year, and there is, I think, finally dedicated software for texts rather than we've been sort of using software that's actually done for genetics. But finally there's kind of dedicated software that we could use maybe in another iteration. But is it worth it? So when you have this many manuscripts, initially I think yes. I'm quite sceptical. I know, in grant applications and stuff you have to put a lot of this digital material in, but I'm also quite sceptical, and often it seems pointless, to be honest. There's a lot of digital humanities that I'm really not sold on, but here I think we really had to do it. I don't see any other way of doing it, because really when you're working on a text like this, when you're working on a trying to understand schematics, you have to hold it all in your head. There's no each person. It's not like you can do that as a team. I don't think so. And with that many manuscripts, it's impossible. So the computer has to do it. Okay. And especially, as I say, with the extreme levels of contamination in this text. So it's, as I said, there's no direct transmission without cross-fertilization, contamination. And so the groupings, the software works it out according to probabilities. it's not clear cut, so it's like the stemma is sort of slightly fuzzy. So that, to do that in your head would be totally impossible. But as I've been trying to emphasise, one must still read. Really the proper work gets done. The computer work has been about 5% or 10% of the whole thing, I think. And then we're just constantly going over it and over it and over it. We've read many passages 10 times or more, each time trying to constitute it according to evolving hypotheses about the transmission. And only in the last 6 months or so, I think, have we really felt satisfied with where we've got to. And it's been our identification of the earliest recension. It's been gratifyingly confirmed by repeated realization that the manuscripts which transmit it contain superior readings, which we hadn't previously noticed. Sometimes we go, that explains that verse that we read wasn't making sense before. And then finally, I rather boldly said, I think, in my sort of abstract, that I would tell you what the text tells us about the development of yoga, that it stopped, really, I think. As I said, that text really sets the blueprint, and in fact, in some levels, it's really not very interesting about the development of yoga, because it's drawing on all these earlier texts which are innovating and bringing new things in, and then Swamitmarama's just trying to synthesize them and sort of smooth out the incongruities and so forth. I say stop for 500 years, because then obviously 20th century comes along and we all know what happened. And then, so Swamitmarama says in the third verse of the text, the compassionate Swamitmarama holds the lamp on Hatha, which is what Haṭhapradīpikā means, for those who cannot find the royal path, so the path to the royal yoga, because they are lost in the darkness of many doctrines. So that's what he's saying that there's all these texts out there, I'm going to synthesize them and make it clear. So he did a very successful job of that, because his synthesis became the blueprint for yoga in almost all subsequent texts. Last slide. What does our new edition mean for the text, rather than for the history of yoga? We've lost or changed quite a lot of well-known sort of popular verses from the text, which is quite strange. There are lots of verses that people repeat and like, and we're claiming that they weren't there in the initial iteration. I mean, that they do come in, and that doesn't mean they're not important, but it's quite interesting that they weren't there, first of all. Quite a few things have changed. Just yesterday I had a project meeting, and we realised that one of the key practices of breath control, which in all texts you'll find called Sheepkara, actually must have been called Sheepkar. Actually, that's a typo. It should be called Sheepkar. It's a small difference, but whether that'll ever get, I think it's too far gone now. I'm sure no one will ever adopt that name. And several borrowings in the text. So, for example, with several borrowings. So, for example, from my PhD, a text I edited for my PhD. The way I dated it was because I thought it was borrowed from in the Haṭhapradīpikā, but in fact it's not in the oldest recensions, and it's quite late. So that throws the dating of a lot of texts completely awry. And then finally, those complications and confusions aside, we've been able to improve the text in many places, and it's definitely been worth it, and it's been a lot of fun. So,
great.
Thank you very much, Jim. What an achievement! This is a kind of lifetime achievement which becomes an instant reference for the community of people studying not only yoga but for Indology in general. Just looking at the number of manuscripts, 250 already when doing a critical edition with 25 manuscripts. It's already a lot, but 250. Just difficult to conceive how the work can be going on, especially if we think of India not as a country, but as a continent, where all the problems are multiplied by the sheer size of the territory. I would like to ask a couple of questions beyond the technicalities about the manuscripts. Where do they come from? Which areas of India, and from which period they are? I suppose the whole team worked on manuscripts on all periods until the very recent manuscripts. Where do they all come from, and where are they located now? I suppose some in the West, some in India. So the periods, and also I would like to ask you, According to the period, you can identify some common problems of manuscripts in certain periods. So if the first manuscripts, extant manuscripts have common problems for the process of editing, and the most recent have other problems. So this would be a question about the manuscripts. I would like also to ask about what happened in the 19th and 20th century. As far as I know, in the 19th and 20th century, for various reasons, different groups of people have become interested in yogic texts. Different groups for different reasons. For instance, I will just mention the freedom fighters in the beginning of the 20th century, which have started to study yoga, going to the Sanskrit tradition of Patanjali and Haṭhapradīpikā, just to strengthen their force in order to be able to fight. So this was, for instance, one group who has started to study yoga, and the physical yoga just out of a particular interest. What happened in that period, and what the manuscripts of this period tell us? And if possible, the third question is concerning the theme. I suppose the number of manuscripts it's a very complex problem. But then the choices that are made, and working with a bigger team than 1-2 persons, adds complexity. How did you select the people for the team? How do you work? I suppose it's a global team.
Yeah, well, it's the UK-German project. So, so there's me and Jason Birch on the UK side, or he's in Tasmania, and then three German researchers. But okay, so three. So the first question is about the manuscript. So the reason I flick back to that, the opening slide, is because that's the oldest manuscript that we found, which I managed to, with a lot of difficulty, get to see in Delhi, because it's actually from a library in Varanasi, where even apparently Baba Ramdev can't get to see it. If anyone knows about him, he's like the biggest yoga guru in India, and he's been trying to see manuscripts, and even he can't see them. But it was microfilmed about 50 years ago, so that's why it's a bit of a sketchy microfilm. I got to see it in Delhi, and that is dated 1497. And as I said, I think the text was written about 1400. So I was very excited to find that manuscript, but it's not the oldest recension. It's, one of the key things people have to understand about editing text is that old manuscript doesn't necessarily equal good manuscript. And we can see already that within 100 years there's lots of corruptions. And in fact, this text has been, the fourth chapter has been removed deliberately. We can tell because they then take out a verse from the first chapter which lists the 4 chapters. And the numbering jumps from 155 to 157. Okay, so it's very, very blatant that something's been done there. And at first I thought, oh, this is the oldest recension, it's only 3 chapters. So sorry, I could ramble on about this for ages, but to get back to the question, so yes, it's not
more recent manuscripts.
More recent manuscripts, yeah. They have a huge distribution all over India. Must be 15 different scripts, I should think, from Kashmir to Kanyakumari. From Pakistan to Assam, and there are 2 or 3 in the Bodleian as well. And quite a lot in, because it's a popular text, and it continued to be copied. I mean, there aren't that many in 19th century, maybe early 19th century. Because I suppose then print culture came along, and there's not much later than that. Second question, so I probably need to. I'm sure you keep looking at your watch, and I'm aware that you need to wrap up. Was the text used? Well, it was one of 2 or 3 texts that were edited and translated at the end of the 19th century. So it's until recently, it's been, they have been the only texts that people have drawn on for the history of physical yoga. To go directly to your question about whether it's contributed to sort of freedom fighters' notions of cultivating strength. Well, it actually is interesting because that practice I mentioned, Vajroli, is a method of maintaining sexual continence. And in fact, there's a quite, I find, maybe I shouldn't find it funny, but entertaining book from Jaipur in about 1935 or 1937 called Vajroli, which draws on this text plus living practitioners of the practice, and is urging India's male youth to take up this practice, because there's obviously a long-held understanding that the loss of your vital fluids, depletes your strength, and it was as part of the freedom movement. So that's all I'll say about that. And the third thing is the team.
Yeah.
So yes, there's this scheme, actually, an advert or a mention of it just went around on the faculty list, didn't it, of this joint AHRC DFE scheme, which you can apply for. It's £350,000 on both sides, although by some strange magic the German money seems to go a lot further, but I won't grumble about that here. Which means that we got me on not much time, Jason on 0.6, and then on the German team they've got Jürgen Haneda, who's a brilliant philologist, great expert in editing texts, and then Mitsuyo Dumoto, who was married to Michael Hahn, widow Michael Hahn. She's the I have to give her credit here. She's sort of engine house of this project. She's amazing, the amount of, and she's full time, and she's the one who, if anyone's got the stemmer in their head, it's her. And then Niels Leersch, who's a doctoral student, but he's on the tech. He's doing the splits tree and all of that. In fact, too much. There's quite a lot of techie stuff that I didn't show you that just was a complete sort of side path that didn't lead to anything. But they're great. They've been fantastic to work with. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Okay, we should probably transition, but maybe someone had a single question. Imre?
Well, it was a particularly popular text, as judged from the number of manuscripts. It's not a very long text, only 400 verses, so probably many people memorized it. And can you take the oral transmission in consideration when you prepare the cladistic analysis?
Very good question, which I hadn't even considered, and I've never met anyone who has I'm not sure that these texts were memorized. Not like your Hindi texts, I don't think. I think they would have been transmitted as manuscripts and then used as mnemonics. I mean, these yoga texts, you couldn't teach yourself yoga from the text. It needs to be explained by a teacher. They're mnemonic texts. So it's an interesting question, which hadn't actually ever occurred to me, but I've certainly in the living tradition, and I've spent a lot of time with traditional yogis in India, I've never met anyone who even considered learning it off by heart. They'll read them, but they don't. So no is the answer there.
Yeah, thanks.
All right, so thank you so much.